By the time you reach your 50s, you believe the most important questions are already answered. But what if one quiet detail proved you were wrong about everything that shaped you? Before we begin, tell me in the comments where this story is finding you today, where you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Morning, afternoon, or late at night. I read every comment, and I am grateful you are here. Now, let us begin. By then, the foundation of who you are feels settled. You know your name. You know where you came from. You know who raised you. You may still question your choices, your regrets, the paths you did or did not take, but the foundation of who you are feels settled, fixed, certain. At 52, Thomas Hale believed this too. He believed that his life, while not extraordinary, was honest, earned. He believed he understood the woman he called his mother. He was wrong, but not in the way people imagine when they hear stories like this. There was no dramatic revelation, no explosive argument, no single moment where the ground cracked open beneath his feet. Instead, the truth entered his life the way many truths do, quietly, inconveniently, almost politely. And because of that, it took time for Thomas to realize that everything he thought he knew had been gently rearranged. Before we go any further, tell me if this opening already feels familiar to you. Have you ever discovered something small that made you question something much bigger? Thank you for being here. Now, let us return to Thomas. Thomas Hale was already well into his life when the first detail failed to line up. He lived with his wife and their 2 children in a comfortable home on a quiet street where the trees had grown tall enough to meet each other over the road. It was not a large house, but it was solid, paid down enough to breathe easily, filled with the quiet clutter of a life in motion. Thomas had built that life deliberately. He worked as a senior municipal planning and compliance director, a role that placed him somewhere between visibility and anonymity. He was respected, trusted, not wealthy, but comfortable enough that money was rarely a source of anxiety. Comfortable enough to take care of people, to step in quietly when help was needed and step back just as quietly when it was not. That had always mattered to him. He handled budgets, long-term infrastructure plans, and regulatory oversight with the same steady discipline he brought home each evening. His colleagues knew him as reliable. His family knew him as present. Not dramatic, not distant, present. He had been married to his wife, Claire, for 23 years. Their marriage was not perfect, but it was grounded, built on shared routines, quiet conversations, and a mutual understanding that love did not always announce itself. Their children were old enough now to be forming their own opinions about the world, old enough to ask questions that did not always have easy answers. Thomas did not yet realize how much that would matter. His mother, Evelyn, was 78, sharp-minded, independent, determined to remain so. She lived alone in the same modest home Thomas had grown up in. He paid for the upkeep now, handled the repairs, made sure her medications were filled on time. He did not announce this help, he simply provided it. Evelyn accepted it without comment. That was how they worked. She had raised him alone, or at least that was the story Thomas had lived inside his entire life. Her husband had been there, but quietly, and never as the center of his care. He never doubted her love. He simply learned early not to expect it to be loud. Evelyn did not hug often. She did not linger on sentiment. She showed love through consistency, through packed lunches prepared before dawn, through clean clothes folded with precision, through being present in the audience at every school play, even when Thomas had only one mind and a trembling voice. She had never missed a parent-teacher meeting, never forgotten a birthday, never failed to show up. And yet, Thomas could not remember a single time she had told him about the day he was born. It was not something he had noticed before. It was simply something that had never been there. The discrepancy appeared while Thomas was preparing documents for early retirement planning. The city required a certified copy of his birth certificate, along with several other records. It was routine. The kind of bureaucratic process Thomas handled for others every day. He requested the document without thought. When it arrived, he noticed the place of birth listed at County Hospital, 2 towns over from where Evelyn had always said he was born. At first, he assumed it was a clerical error. These things happened, more often than people realized. But then he noticed the date. It was correct. The name was correct. But the attending physician was unfamiliar, and the address listed for his mother at the time did not match the small rental home he remembered from his earliest years. It was a minor inconsistency, the kind most people would shrug off. Thomas did not shrug. Instead, he set the paper down on the kitchen counter and stared at it longer than necessary. Claire noticed. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing up from the stove. "Yeah," Thomas said. "Just paperwork." He folded the document carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He told himself he would ask Evelyn the next time they spoke. He did not. A week passed. Then 2. Thomas found himself thinking about his childhood more often than usual. Not the painful moments. There were few of those. His upbringing had been quiet, safe, predictable. What surfaced instead were neutral memories that suddenly felt weighted. His Aunt Margaret walking him to school when Evelyn was working late. Margaret attending his doctor appointments. Margaret knowing which foods he refused to eat and which nightmares woke him in the middle of the night. Margaret was always nearby. Even now, she still was. Thomas sent her money occasionally, the way one does when care becomes mutual rather than directional. She never asked for it. He never mentioned it. At the time, Thomas had assumed her presence in his childhood was simply how families worked. That some aunts were more involved than others. That some relatives became second parents without ceremony. Now, he noticed how often Margaret had been the one to sit beside his bed when he was sick. How often she had been the one who spoke on his behalf. How rarely Evelyn had explained why. Thomas finally brought up the birth certificate on Sunday afternoon call. He mentioned it casually, the way he mentioned most things to Evelyn, as if it were nothing more than an administrative curiosity. Evelyn listened in silence. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but slower than usual. "That must be a mistake," she said. Thomas waited. "I will look for my old records," she added. "Those hospitals merged years ago. Things get mixed up." It was a reasonable explanation. Thomas accepted it. Or rather, he tried to. But after the call ended, he realized something unsettled him more than the document itself. Evelyn had not sounded surprised. The next time Thomas visited, he paid closer attention. He noticed how Evelyn avoided discussing the past in specifics, how she spoke in generalities, how stories never quite anchored themselves to dates or places. He also noticed something else. Margaret was there. She always seemed to be there. She arrived with groceries, checked Evelyn's medication, asked Thomas about his children with a familiarity that felt more parental than avuncular. At one point, Margaret touched his shoulder as she passed behind him. The gesture was brief, natural, protective. Thomas felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. That night, lying awake in his childhood bedroom, he realized a truth he had never articulated before. He had always felt cared for, but he had never felt claimed. If this part of the story is resonating with you, let me know by simply commenting, "I am listening." Your presence here matters more than you know. Now, back to the story. The question pressed harder over the following weeks, not as suspicion, as curiosity. Thomas returned to the city archives, this time not as an employee, but as a man looking for something he could not yet name. He requested older records, hospital logs, admission notes. What he found did not provide answers. It provided silence. Certain documents were missing. Others were incomplete. Notes ended abruptly. It was not evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of erasure, done to keep a story simple. That realization stayed with him. Someone had not wanted a story preserved. Thomas asked Evelyn again. This time, directly. I need to know, he said. Is there something about my birth I do not know? The pause on the other end of the line was long enough to taunt. Yes, Evelyn said at last. She did not elaborate. She did not apologize. She did not explain. There are things that were handled, she said carefully. Things that were done because they had to be. By who? Thomas asked. Evelyn exhaled slowly. You should talk to Margaret. That night. Thomas did not sleep. He replayed every memory he could summon, searching not for proof, but for understanding. He wondered whether love could exist alongside omission, whether protection could wear the shape of silence, whether a life could be built on something missing and still stand. He thought about his wife sleeping beside him, about his children down the hall, about the stories he assumed they would inherit. He realized, with a quiet ache, that no matter what he learned next, his past would not disappear, but it might change its meaning. When Thomas finally sat across from Margaret, she did not pretend. She did not deny. She did not delay. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him the way she always had, with care, with resolve, and with a tenderness that felt suddenly devastating. You were never abandoned, she said. You were placed. Margaret did not rush her words. She had waited more than 50 years to speak them, and she understood something Thomas did not yet fully grasp. Once spoken, the truth would not return to silence. They were seated at her kitchen table, the same table where Thomas had eaten countless meals as a child. The surface bore faint scratches from decades of use. A life lived carefully, but not delicately. Margaret poured tea he had not asked for, set the cup in front of him, then sat back down. She placed her hands flat on the table, steadying herself, a gesture Thomas had never seen from her before. Tamely then did she begin. You were born to my sister, she said. Not my younger sister. Not my troubled sister. Just my sister. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any dramatic confession could have. Thomas did not respond immediately, and then he noticed something else. She did not say your mother. She said my sister. Her name was Rose. Margaret spoke it carefully, like a fragile object that could fracture if handled without respect. Rose had been vibrant once, intelligent, hopeful, reckless in the way youth sometimes mistakes courage for invincibility. She laughed easily. She believed people meant what they promised. She had become pregnant at a time when pregnancy outside marriage was not treated as a complication, but as a verdict. Her family had not responded with cruelty. They responded with fear, fear of judgment, fear of consequence, fear of being seen. Margaret described it without accusation, without bitterness, only as a truth shaped by the era they lived in. Rose was sent away quietly, not because she wanted to disappear, because she was told she must. Thomas listened, absorbing the information slowly, the way a body absorbs cold water. Shock first, then numbness, then awareness. Did she want me? He asked. Margaret met his eyes. Yes, she said. More than anything. The certainty in her voice landed harder than Thomas expected. She wanted you, Margaret continued. But wanting was not enough back then. Not for someone like her. Not with no protection. No money. No place to return to without consequences. Margaret paused, as if measuring how much truth could be carried at once. She was told that loving you meant letting you go. Rose gave birth alone. Margaret was there for part of it, though she never described the room in detail. Only the sounds, the exhaustion, the way Rose had held Thomas for a long time afterward, memorizing him as if memory could replace presence. She had named him. Thomas felt a quiet jolt move through his chest. The name he had always carried was not the one he had been born with. What was my name? He asked. Margaret hesitated, just long enough for Thomas to understand that the name mattered. Then she told him. He did not repeat it out loud. He tested it silently, letting the unfamiliar syllables rest in his mind. It did not feel like his name, but it did feel like a beginning. After the birth, The family faced a choice. Rose could not return home with a child, not without consequences that would follow her forever. There was talk of adoption, of institutions, of arrangements that would erase her entirely from Thomas's life. Margaret intervened. She offered to take him, not as a temporary solution, as a permanent one. She would raise him, protect him, give him a life untouched by the circumstances of his birth. But the arrangement came with conditions. Silence was one of them. Margaret's voice lowered as she continued. Evelyn agreed to raise you publicly, to be the one the world saw. She was steady, unquestioned, safe. Thomas nodded slowly. And her husband? He asked. Margaret did not look surprised by the question. He knew, she said. From the beginning, he agreed because he believed a child deserved one story, not many. He loved you in his way, but he was not a man who spoke much. Thomas felt something settle into place. His memories of Evelyn's husband were faint. A quiet presence, a man who worked, ate dinner, read the paper, and died when Thomas was still young enough for grief to be confusing rather than sharp. That is why you took her name, Margaret said. It was never questioned. It was simpler that way. Margaret looked older as she explained the rest, as though carrying the truth openly now costs something physical. I was not chosen because I loved you too much, he said quietly. They thought that would complicate things. She did not sound resentful, only factual. Thomas felt something shift inside him. All his life, he had sensed Margaret's presence as something deeper than obligation. Now he understood why Rose left shortly after, not because she wanted to vanish, but because she was told it was the only way everyone else could stay intact. She wrote letters at first, long ones, careful ones. Margaret read them aloud to Thomas when he was an infant, though he could not understand the words. Eventually, the letters stopped. Not because Rose stopped loving him, because she was asked to stop existing. Did she ever try to come back? Thomas asked. Margaret looked away. She asked, she said. More than once. But by then, Thomas had a life, a routine, a story. And the family decided that disrupting it would be worse than maintaining the lie. Margaret had argued. She lost. Silence became the price of stability. Rose disappeared into another life, another city, another version of herself that never got to be a mother. Margaret remained, always close, always watching, always restrained. Thomas realized then that Margaret had lived her life in proximity to something she could never claim. She had loved him openly, but never fully. Why tell me now? Thomas asked. Margaret exhaled slowly. Because Evelyn is tired, she said. And because secrets grow heavier with time. And because I did not want you to learn this when no one could answer your questions. She reached across the table, hesitated, then rested her hand over his. You deserved the truth before it turned into regret. Let us pause here for a moment. If you are still with me, let me know in the comments what this moment stirred in you. One word is enough. Let us continue. That night, Thomas drove home in silence. He did not turn on the radio. He did not call anyone. When he pulled into his driveway, the lights were on. His children's backpacks were by the door. Clara's shoes sat where they always did. He stayed in the car for a long moment. Inside, his life was waiting. The truth settled the way dust settles after a long disturbance. Slowly, inevitably, he thought about all the moments Margaret had hovered at the edges of his life. The way she never missed a milestone. The way she stepped back, just before claiming space. The way she loved him without permission. And he understood something else. Margaret had not stayed because she was strong. She had stayed because leaving would have broken her. Thomas did not sleep well. He dreamed of doors closing softly, of footsteps fading, of a woman standing just beyond a threshold, watching a child grow without stepping forward. When he woke, he felt older, not diminished, just aware. The next morning, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror, and studied his reflection. For the first time, he wondered whose face he was wearing. He did not feel betrayed. He felt rearranged, a feeling that would return. The truth had not destroyed his past. It had given it depth. Thomas did not tell anyone for several days. Not because he was ashamed of the truth, and not because he doubted it. He kept it to himself because he needed time to understand where it belonged inside him. Some truths do not demand immediate reaction. They require rearrangement. He went to work. He answered emails. He nodded politely in meetings. He completed tasks he had completed hundreds of times before. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt newly labeled. At home, he moved through familiar routines with unfamiliar weight. Dinner at the table. Homework spread across the counter. His children arguing quietly over nothing that mattered. Claire noticed the pause in him before he answered questions. The way he listened longer than usual. The way his eyes lingered when he tucked the children in at night. "You are quiet," she said one evening, after the house had settled. "I am just tired," Thomas replied. It was not a lie. It was not the whole truth. He found himself replaying childhood scenes with a new lens. Margaret tying his shoes with meticulous care. Margaret waiting outside his classroom until the bell rang. Margaret knowing when he was lying before he did. At the time, these moments had blended into the background of his upbringing. Now they rose to the surface, vivid and precise. They were not acts of convenience. They were acts of attachment. Thomas realized that Margaret had lived in a permanent state of restraint. Always present. Never claiming, loving him fully, while pretending not to. It was a kind of devotion that required constant discipline. He watched his own children sleep and felt something tighten in his chest. He tried to imagine choosing distance instead of presence, silence instead of claiming. He could not. That was when Rose became real to him, in a way she had not before. He thought about Evelyn next, the woman who had raised him publicly, the woman whose last name he carried, the woman whose discipline had been firm, whose affection had been measured, whose commitment had never wavered. Evelyn had never told him she loved him. She had shown it instead through consistency, so reliable it bordered on invisibility. At first, Thomas felt a flicker of resentment. Then he understood something that softened it. Evelyn had not been withholding. She had been careful. She had accepted a role that demanded steadiness without intimacy, authority without possession, responsibility without origin. She had raised a child she did not birth without ever allowing herself to blur the boundary. Perhaps that restraint had been her way of honoring the truth she could never speak. Thomas visited Evelyn the following weekend. He did not announce his intention. He simply showed up, carrying groceries she did not need. She looked at him longer than usual when she opened the door. They sat at the kitchen table where Thomas had done his homework as a boy. The same table where Evelyn had signed permission slips, paid bills, balanced the household budget. Thomas noticed her hands now, thinner, slower, still precise. "I spoke to Margaret," he said. Evelyn nodded. "I assumed you would." There was no apology in her voice, no defensiveness. Just acceptance. "Why did you not tell me?" Thomas asked. Not accusing, not pleading. Evelyn looked down at her tea. "Because you were happy," she said, "and because children do not need truths that only make adults feel lighter." Thomas considered this. "You never wanted me to know," he said. "I wanted you to live," Evelyn replied. "Not analyze." Her words were simple. They carried the weight of a lifetime. "I loved you," she continued, "in the way I knew how, in the way I was asked to." Thomas nodded. For the first time, he understood that Evelyn had not been emotionally distant. She had been emotionally disciplined. They did not cry. They did not embrace. They sat together in a shared understanding that neither of them had chosen freely, and yet both had stayed. That mattered. That night, Thomas told Claire. They sat on the edge of the bed, the house quiet around them. "I found something out," he said. She waited. I was not born to Evelyn, he continued. She raised me, but my biological mother was her sister. Claire did not interrupt. She listened the way she always had. When he finished, she asked only one question. Does this change who you are? Thomas thought carefully before answering. No, he said. It explains me. Claire reached for his hand. Then we will carry it together, she said. They did not discuss whether the children needed to know. Not yet. Some truths needed time before they became inheritance. After that visit, Thomas walked through his childhood neighborhood alone. The houses looked smaller than he remembered. The streets, narrower. Memory had a way of enlarging what once felt vast. He stopped outside the house Margaret had lived in when he was a child, now occupied by strangers. He imagined her inside years ago, pacing carefully around invisible boundaries, loving a child she could not claim. He imagined Rose somewhere else entirely, and for the first time, he allowed himself to think about her as a person, not as an absence. Rose became real to him in fragments, a woman, young and afraid, a woman holding her child and being told love was not enough, a woman who disappeared, not because she lacked courage, but because she was outnumbered. Thomas wondered what her life had been like, whether she had married, or whether she had other children, whether she had ever allowed herself to speak his name aloud. The questions were endless. The answers were not guaranteed. Margaret called him one evening. She did not ask how he was doing. She knew better than that. I kept something, she said. Thomas closed his eyes. What? He asked. Letters, Margaret replied, from Rose. I did not read them all. I was not sure I was allowed to. They met the next day. Margaret handed him a small box, worn at the corners, carefully preserved. Inside were letters written in careful handwriting, some folded, some unopened. Thomas did not read them immediately. He held the box in his lap, feeling its weight. This was not evidence. It was a life defer. When he finally opened the first letter, he did so slowly. Rose wrote about ordinary things, the weather, work, loneliness. She wrote about Thomas, though never by name. She described him as growing without her, as becoming something she could only imagine. She never asked for forgiveness. She never explained herself. She simply loved him on paper, because it was the only place she was allowed to. Thomas read until his eyes burned. Then he stopped. Not because he was overwhelmed, because he needed to breathe. The question of whether to find Rose settled into his thoughts quietly. There was no urgency, no dramatic pull, just a steady consideration. What would he gain by finding her? What would he risk? He was not angry. He was not searching for apology. He was searching for coherence. Margaret answered the question one evening without realizing it. You do not owe anyone a reunion, she said. Sometimes understanding is enough. Thomas knew then that he did not need to see Rose to honor her. He did not need to hear her voice to validate her love. He already had evidence. He returned the letters to the box, not to hide them, to preserve them. Some truths were meant to be carried, not consumed. As weeks passed, Thomas felt his identity settle again, not into certainty, into complexity. He was not less grounded for knowing the truth. He was more human. He had been loved in 3 different ways. By a woman who gave birth to him and let him go. By a woman who stayed close and loved quietly. By a woman who raised him without claiming origin. None of them were wrong. All of them had chosen him. And Thomas understood something else now. Motherhood was not a single role. It was a series of choices made under pressure. And sometimes the bravest choice was the one that went unseen. Time did not rush Thomas toward resolution. It softened him instead. Weeks passed, then months, and the knowledge he carried stopped feeling like a disruption and began to feel like context. He did not wake each morning thinking about the truth. He woke thinking about his day, his work, the quiet changes in his body that reminded him time was no longer abstract. And yet, everything he did now rested on a deeper foundation. Understanding had quietly replaced confusion. Thomas found himself watching his children more closely. Not out of fear, out of recognition. He noticed the way his daughter leaned into him without thinking. The way his son asked questions and waited for real answers. He realized how easily love could be assumed, how devastating it must be when it cannot be claimed openly. One evening, after helping with homework, his daughter asked a simple question. "Dad," she said, "who taught you how to do all this?" Thomas paused. He thought of Evelyn's discipline, Margaret's presence, Rose's absence, all the people who stayed. He answered. She accepted this without pressing. Children often understand more than they explain. Thomas visited Evelyn more often. Not out of obligation, out of recognition. He noticed the small rituals she maintained, the careful way she organized her kitchen, the notes she left herself on the counter, the discipline that had structured her entire life. One afternoon, as he helped her sort through old papers, she paused. "I was afraid you would leave," she said. It was the closest she had ever come to vulnerability. "I will not," Thomas replied. "I never did." She nodded, absorbing the reassurance without comment. That was how they communicated best. Later, as he stood to leave, Evelyn spoke again. "You are a good father," she said. Thomas understood what she was really saying. "I taught you how." Margaret's health began to decline shortly after. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sudden, just the slow accumulation of years finally asserting themselves. Thomas drove her to appointments, sat beside her in quiet waiting rooms, held space without filling it. At one visit, Margaret looked at him and smiled faintly. "You grew up well," she said. Thomas understood what she meant immediately. Not that he had been successful, that he had been safe. He did not answer her then. Some acknowledgments required time before they could be spoken without breaking something. That night, as they sat together after dinner, the words returned to him. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "I know," he said. Margaret exhaled slowly. That was enough. They spoke less about the past now. Not because it was forbidden, but because it had found its place. Margaret never asked for acknowledgement, never sought validation for the life she had lived in proximity to his. Her love had never required witness. Thomas never searched for Rose, not because the past no longer mattered, but because he had already learned what it had given him. Not because he lacked courage, because he had already found her in the only way that mattered, in the shape of his values, in the quiet steadiness of his choices, in the restraint he now recognized as love. One evening, alone in his study, Thomas opened the box of letters again. He read until he reached the first one Rose had written after his birth. This time, he did not stop before the final paragraph. She had written his name there, the name she had given him. Daniel, not Thomas. A name full of hope, soft at the edges, unused. Thomas said it once, out loud. Daniel. Only once. It did not replace who he was. It honored who she had been. That was enough. Before the story closes, I want to ask you something quietly. Who in your life loved you without asking to be seen? If someone comes to mind, hold that thought or share it in the comments if you feel comfortable. Now, let us finish the story. On his 53rd birthday, Thomas wrote 3 letters, one to Evelyn, one to Margaret, one to Rose. He did not send the last one. He did not need to. Writing it was enough. To Evelyn, he wrote about gratitude, about structure, about being raised without chaos. To Margaret, he wrote about presence, about the courage to stay silent and still love. To Rose, he wrote about forgiveness he did not realize he had carried. He told her he had lived a good life. He told her she had not failed. He told her he understood. Thomas folded the letters carefully and placed them in the same box as Rose's. Not as evidence, as lineage. Years later, when Thomas finally retired, he downsized his life. He donated what he no longer needed, simplified his days. One afternoon, as he sorted through old photographs, his son asked, "Why is it that you do not talk much about your childhood?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Because what mattered stayed," he said. His son nodded, satisfied. One evening, sitting beside Claire, Thomas spoke quietly. "Do you think we should tell them everything?" Claire considered this. "When they need it," she said. "Not before." Thomas agreed. Some truths were not secrets. They were inheritances, given when the hands were ready to hold them. As the years passed, Thomas realized something that surprised him. He did not feel incomplete. He felt assembled at last. The truth had not taken anything from him. It had given him language. Language for restraint. Language for sacrifice. Language for love that chooses invisibility. In the end, Thomas understood something simple, and he let the understanding settle. Family was not defined by who claimed you. It was defined by who stayed when claiming you came at cost. Some mothers give birth. Some mothers raise. Some mothers let go. All of them love. And sometimes, the greatest proof of love is not presence. It is the willingness to disappear so someone else can remain. Thomas carried that understanding quietly for the rest of his life. He did not correct people when they spoke of his mother. He did not complicate the story. He honored it. Because truth did not require performance. It required respect. There are truths that arrive late, and sometimes they ask us only to listen before we move on, not to punish us, but to give us mercy, to remind us that love is not always loud. That sacrifice is not always visible, and that the people who shape us most are often the ones who ask for nothing in return. If this story stayed with you, take a moment before you move on. Some stories are meant to be felt, not rushed past. If you feel comfortable, share in the comments what this story reminded you of, or simply let me know that you listened all the way through. On the screen is another story I highly recommend. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next life story.